Hello everyone, I'm Whitney. I'm going to be presenting to you on Time Maps, Collective Memory and the Social Shape of the Past. James and I read this book together, and it was published in 2003. The author is Eviatar Zerubavel. He's down here in the corner, his picture. He's a professor in the sociology department at Rutgers, actually. And this is a link if you would like to get access to the digital book yourself afterwards. Okay, so the objective of the book was to identify patterns and structure of social memory. In Zerubavel's own words, he wanted to identify the common generic underpinnings of the social structure of memory and to develop a transcultural as well as a transhistorical perspective on social memory as a generic phenomenon. So he's really looking at things at a macro level, and down here, some sideline research that I was doing was on a micro level of some performance artists doing some research on the nature of mnemonic editing and on a very small scale with performance artists and their audiences. This was part of an artist in residence program in France in 2016. So check out these links if you want to look more into that. But I'm just doing a comparison here between like a micro level of mnemonic editing and a macro level. So mnemonic is the way we create and store and change memories. So that's really what Zerubavel is doing, is grappling with the shape of social memory, how we create it and edit it. And he's identifying visuals and language to turn what might seem like an amorphous and larger than life thing, like all of social memory, into a coherent theory with models. So his methods are using secondary resources through case studies. So he uses 571 total sources, and the book's only 110 pages. So he really jams a lot of examples into these pages to explain how he identified patterns and then created the figures, which I'll go through. He has 24 figures in the book. I've included quite a few of them in this presentation that kind of visually map out what's happening with social memory and different activities of social memory. And the case studies fall into the categories of paleontology, national holidays, genealogy, and politics. And for original analysis from primary resources, he does an analysis of 191 national calendars tracking commemorative holidays that will come up in one of the figures, but most of the research is through secondary sources of case studies. The contents are an introduction and 5 chapters. I'll get into those in detail individually. So chapter 1 is called The Social Shape of the Past, and in it Zerubavel explains the idea of progress versus decline narratives and tree narratives, sociomnemonic pluralism, which is the idea that cultural evolutionism is happening where cultures evolve in different ways from the same starting point, like they branch off. And this branching idea, this multilinear historical narratives idea, can be represented by cladograms. And Zerubavel talks about the history of cladograms and how they were used by theorists and researchers such as August Schleicher, looking at linguistics in the 1850s, and Darwin also in the 19th century to look at the bifurcation of species. Especially in this book, Zerubavel is going to go into depth about the evolution of the human species. And for me, this reminds me of the butterfly effect in chaos theory, how something that happens has a ripple effect where many things are impacted after a singular event. So that's a bifurcation and a branching type of theory. So that's a little overlay with some other topics. And Zerubavel uses a quote attributed to Mark Twain to explain kind of the shape of social memory in terms of cycles and rhymes. And the quote is, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes." So historical rhyming is the idea that even though events change and context change, sometimes there are patterns and cycles to the types of events and people that we see. So particularly right now in the United States, we are about a month out, less than a month out from a presidential election, and every 4 years in the US can be considered an election year. And that means a certain type of environment and change in interpersonal as well as community and national relationships between different community groups in such time. And in terms of figures, popes and dictators have certain associations, just those categorizations of those types of figures has a rhyming pattern to the social memory of them. And also events such as wartime, Zerubavel didn't really mention pandemics in detail, but I think especially this year, the social rhyming of pandemics, we've seen where people are making comparisons between how this pandemic is being handled compared to the swine flu, and also the way that society handled itself and handled its dead and handled public health during the 1918 influenza epidemic, and also like the plague, the Black Death in Europe centuries ago. So here are the figures for the progress versus decline narratives. And these mean that as time goes on, people could view things as getting better or getting worse. And those social memory patterns could be happening at the same time by different groups. So that's the idea of sociomnemonic pluralism. And then we already talked about this tree narrative a little bit. This is like a cladogram. And the idea of cousinhood is that things that are at the same point in time, same point in time on the cladogram are cousins to each other. So orangutans and chimps and gorillas would be our cousins as opposed to our ancestors, because they're not our ancestors. The common ancestors are all of our ancestors. That's the idea with cousinhood. And sociomnemonic density is the idea that there could be focus on certain periods of activity, and then ignoring events that happen during lulls of history. So these national commemorograms is where Zerubavel looked at the number of national holidays. And here for Thailand example, the national holidays that they celebrate now, or in 2003 at least when the book was published, half of them were, or not half, but a good deal were from, like 2,500 years ago, and then a few hundred years ago, and you see this huge blank space in between where apparently nothing important happened for their nation that's relevant enough to the current society to make a national holiday, even though these really old ones were apparently really important. Staccato versus legato narratives is the idea that some narratives can be continual, which means gradual small changes that flow one after another, versus a staccato narrative is where abrupt change happens in a rapid period, or almost in an instant, and then there's like times of low activity. And this pairs well with the sociomnemonic density idea that things happen in spurts. Historical continuity is the idea that we have different types of bridging methods, physical, calendrical, iconic, and discursive, to tie together past events to the present through place, historical analogies, and discursive continuity, which is things such as symbols like names. Someone could name their child after their grandmother to create a sense of continuity of that family's essence, spirit, and improve or aid the memory of the ancestors. So that's mnemonic pasting, where we're using these different types of bridging methods to tie the past to the present. Ancestry and descent is a certain type of genealogical bridging that's used for dynasties, family trees, and pedigrees. And this is the idea that there are certain lines of connection, direct lines of connection, sometimes through blood, sometimes through an office, like the office of the president for Rutgers. It's a successive chain, and it's like a relay race in a way where one leader comes right after the other and picks up where the last left off, and they share an office, share a title, share a symbolic role for the university. So these are historical contact chains. And then historical contact chains don't always have to be with certain positions and official roles. They can be really casual. For example, in the book, Zerubavel talks about a children's author whose great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, I don't remember how many greats it was, but she shook the hand of Abraham Lincoln. And since that woman, touched her descendants' hands, who touched their descendants' hands, who touched their descendants' hands, who touched the author's hands, in a way, that author was connected to Abraham Lincoln through that contact chain. Ancestry and descent can be viewed in terms of genealogical distance and ancestral depth, and that's like the number of links connecting different entities to past events or activities or persons. And social distance is the idea that the bifurcation, the more recently it's happened, the closer you are to your contemporaries. And then monogeneous versus polygeneous human descent. This is somewhere where James and I thought Zerubavel got a little lost in the weeds, because most of his case studies and all the other chapters talk about a broad range of case studies, but he really focuses on paleontology for a long time in this one. It was interesting, but I don't know that these models apply so much to anything other than biology and evolution chains. He didn't explain how these models could be used for other forms of social memory. Historical discontinuity is the idea that there's watersheds, which are discrete periods which inflate mental divides, that beginnings can be illusions and are socially constructed is also a method of creating historical discontinuity. And then mnemonic editing is where there's cutting and pasting, basically ignoring certain periods and then smushing together others to create like these senses of divides and separateness. And systems of periodization. I'll let you pause the video and look at these figures. And then chapter 5 is in the beginnings. He talks about antiquity and how identity, depth creates identity and also legitimacy. So that was with this like mnemonic decapitation idea, you know, that certain communities will create social memory that ignores what comes before they find important. They establish their beginning and then kind of invalidate, undermine, or just undervalue other communities that they don't care about as much. So an example of that would be when the Europeans came to the United States and nowadays people who are descendants of those European immigrants are trying to outpass other immigrants by saying we were here first, but the Native Americans are like, let me help you remember that you also were an immigrant and are not the original, you know, wards of this land type of idea. The reception was very positive for the book. The case studies, I think, are woven together really well to create the figures. James and I discussed how we were very impressed by the research behind this, and it's had far reach. According to Google Scholar, there's 1,526 citations. And I thought it was funny that Zerubavel only a few times let his personal enthusiasm slip through, and he referred to certain ideas of social memory activities as titillating, which is kind of funny. And like I said, we thought that chapter 3 got a little lost in the weeds with the paleontology stuff, but overall, well-researched, clear figures. I would recommend that you go back through and look at those figures a little bit more. A critique that was present in a couple of the reviews was that Zerubavel is overgeneralizing certain groups and creating like we's for communities that might be a religious group or like residents of a certain nation. But the case studies are only a sentence or two each, so I think it would be hard to give credit to the diversity within those groups. He's looking for the overall patterns, so we didn't think that this detracted too much from the book, even though that was one of the official critiques in one of the reviews. Here's some additional resources. You can check out those links. And here's our references. Thank you so much. Okay. Trying to stop the share. Okay.